Hey guys, it's Mad Master here doing a video. This one's kind of an impromptu video I decided to do. So it's unscripted, so just forgive me for my unscriptedness. So basically what prompted this video is a lot of what I've read over the years on blabbermouth.net, which is a metal hard rock website, and just interviews with basically a lot of musicians, and then not a lot of musicians, but a few, and people's comments on articles on Blabbermouth and elsewhere. So there's this idea going around that musicians or rock or metal musicians should not talk about politics. And when I first read this, I was like, well, you know, I understand what they're getting at. There's these loudmouth people that blab about whoever they're voting for or what, you know, their political beliefs are, you know, at the moment or whatever. And, you know, there's nothing that annoys me more than seeing like a presidential candidate have some band or a musician that I respect, you know, going and basically supporting them, even though, like, you know, maybe they contradict what they actually stand for in some of their songs. Case in point, you know, Bruce Springsteen, you know, playing for some Democrat politicians and who would support free trade, and then, you know, he talks about in some of his music about the working man or whatever. You know, it's kind of a contradiction. So that's one thing that gets annoying. And then, you know, sometimes musicians will be really a bunch of loudmouths about politics in general. And so, like, people like Gene Simmons say, you know, people should stay out of politics if they're a musician. So I started to think about it, and I was like, well, when has rock or metal ever not been political? And I really thought about it, and I think going back to the beginnings of rock and roll, maybe it wasn't explicitly political, but by, you know, socio-political, whatever you want to call it, by being a rock musician, it was inherently, you know, implicitly a political act. Because I'll give you an example. So if you're playing this, you know, they used to call it jungle music, you know, the white racists in the South, R&B, rock and roll, whatever. So if you're playing this stuff, you're already, you know, doing something political in a certain way. And then you go to the 60s and, you know, all the political stuff that was going on with Vietnam and everything. I mean, every band had to have songs about the war. I mean, the only people that were supporting the war weren't in rock and roll, weren't in rock bands. The whole, you know, the whole anti-establishment movement in the 60s, and the all the, you know, the musicians that were involved in the protests and, you know, their political opinions. I mean, everybody that was a rock star in the 60s was left-wing. And that's a controversial statement, but pretty much the majority. I won't say everybody. And then, you know, there's some historical revisionism, like, you know, with someone like Ted Nugent. He's like, well, I didn't know those were pot pipes on the cover of the Amboy Dukes album. Fucking bullshit. You know, so, you know, the whole thing was and is a movement against the establishment. And at that point, it was very left-wing. The, you know, the anti-establishmentarianism, or whatever the word is. I forgot what that word, you know, that there's a word for that. So, you know, the people in that hippie movement or whatever, rock and roll, you know, that was their thing, was a left-wing movement. And it was, you know, arguably it was left-wing, but it was also anti-establishment, you know, anti-authoritarian, etc. So what happened in the 70s is a lot of these rock stars found themselves with a lot of money because they got rich from being a rock star. So some of them got so into drugs and being rich, they started to veer a little bit to the right, even though it was totally contradicting maybe their lyrics or what they were into before. You know, half the bands had political songs or psychedelic, you know, mind-expanding ideas, you know, or, you know, countercultural ideas. And the culture, there was a generation gap, there was the Vietnam War, you know, there was all this stuff. So in the 70s, some of these guys, like Eric Clapton, believe he supported some right-wing politicians in the mid 70s or late 70s. It was very controversial. I think he later recanted some of his stuff. And same with David Bowie. They were kind of flirting with a little right-wing stuff for a while, which was a little bit strange, especially considering where they were from. So what had happened in the late 70s is that, some of these rock bands from the 60s were starting to get rich, and they were selling out, quote unquote. That's what what it was called, and still sort of is. And the punk bands came about, and they were another anarchist, left-wing, whatever movement against the establishment. And they saw these old dinosaurs that, basically these bloated old rock bands that weren't really that old, obviously. Some of them might have been, even still in their 20s, some of the members of the bands. But the punks saw this stuff, and they said, fuck you, and they did these bands, like the Sex Pistols or, these other bands. And I'm not saying every punk musician or every musician in a rock band was left-wing, even back then. But it was a very anti-establishment thing. And by the way, one of the biggest bullshit establishments nowadays is the Democratic Party. No doubt about that. So this is not coming from a Democrat mindset at all. It's not coming from a Republican mindset, but at least they're predictably crazy. But anyways. So what happened after that? Well, rock kind of, became more establishment, and, it became more and more establishment. So you had more people coming out and saying, oh, well, I'm a Republican, I voted for Reagan, whoever the fuck said that. There was obviously rock stars that were saying that sometimes, very rarely. And it was still a minority of people that were into the mainstream right-wing politics who were rockers. I mean, it's mainly country music and, whatever the fuck stars that were into that. So, but, I mean, punk continued and hardcore, and this is a very important point I'm trying to bring up here. So what happened in the 80s with metal? Well, there was a new movement called thrash metal. And thrash metal was born out of two genres of music, basically, hardcore punk and metal. And thrash metal carried over a lot of the left-wing anti-establishment politics of its predecessor, hardcore punk. So you had DRI, Suicidal Tendencies, Cryptic Slaughter, and, then proto-grindcore, Napalm Death, all these bands, all these left-wing politics, that were inspired by Dead Kennedys or Crass or whoever. And that became a thing. And, you had Metallica singing about the justice system, regardless of what James Hetfield is into now politically. He was singing about the death penalty, all these things that were left-wing, whatever you want to fucking call it. So, and Megadeth as well. I mean, Dave Mustaine, in the early 90s, he was a shill for the Democrats on MTV. I'm not saying that's a good thing either, but I'm saying that he was definitely more left-wing in the 80s, even more, probably. So you had all these thrash bands that were, singing from that point of view. So that was a really inspirational thing on all sorts of metal, And you had the far right, just crazy black metal bands later on. And you had all these other, they weren't really as political, though, in some ways, as far as lyrically, unless you're talking about, like, the Nazi black metal bands, which kind of rose out of that. So anyways, but, they kept going. And metal bands aren't necessarily liberal. I would say metal as a genre is more libertarian than anything. And libertarian sometimes from a right-wing perspective, sometimes from more of a left-wing perspective. But I think overall that's where it lies. And, you can also maybe even argue that black metal had like an environmental, ecological message inadvertently, because it was about returning to nature and shit. And as part of that, part of that baggage that comes along with that is the neo-romantic movement. They kind of took a lot of the 1800s romantic movement of music and ideas like Nietzsche or Richard Wagner or whoever. I don't know if I'm even pronouncing either one of those right, but I know I'm pronouncing Richard Wagner. I've heard Nietzsche or Nietzsche's name pronounced various ways over the years. So they took a lot of that stuff, and a lot of that argues against modern society and stuff. So that's why you have all these. In some ways, that's why you have all these album covers with forests and mountains and all this shit. And plus, Norway is a beautiful country too. I've never been there, but anyways, the whole point is metal and rock have a history of being anti-establishment, and that is inherently political. So when these rich rock stars, Gene Simmons included, say, "Oh, metal or rock shouldn't be political. Shut up, shut up and sing." It's like, well, it's never been about shutting up and singing. That was Pat Boone that was shutting up and singing in the 50s, covering Little Richard or whatever and totally sanitizing the shit. That was shutting up and singing and going along and sucking the fucking giant cock of the establishment. And that's what it kind of pisses me off, that people are so fucking ignorant about their history of their music. I mean, metal and rock have always been political. And you have the establishment people, you have the anti-establishment people, you have the far left people like Tom Morello. You have people that are a little bit less, they're no less far left, but they're not as into like fucking Maoist guerrilla movements in South America. Like, I doubt Jello Biafra would support any of those people anytime soon, obviously. And you have, but you have Nazi black metal musicians, and you have Ted Nugent. So metal has always been political. Rock is inherently begins as a political act, even if it's not explicitly political. And people just need to shut the fuck up when they're criticizing metal and rock for being political, in my opinion, because they're wrong. It's always been political. It'll always have some elements that are political. So it's like, oh, they shouldn't talk about politics or saving the It's like, fucking, that's part of the history. A lot of it was protest music in the 60s. They picked up on what the earlier people were doing, unless you were Shana Na or some shit, Just a fucking bunch of bullshit. It angers me when I read posts about that and people are debating this, whether rock or metal should be political. It doesn't always have to be political. It doesn't all have to be political. But to deny the history that rock and roll and metal have within politics, or being political, or socio-political, maybe it's sociological. I don't know. Maybe I'm using the wrong word sometimes for this. I don't know. But it's always been about something in regards to being anti-establishment. And to deny that, it's just plain ignorance. That's all for this video. Please subscribe. Hope you like the video, and share it and jack off to it or rub your clit to it or whatever.